I'm getting some of my notes off her cell phone, and I don't have her password.
We got it.
Yep. Thank you for coming, and I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to see a pretty full house. I had the, is it on?
Oh, we did. Did I?
It looks like it's on.
Okay.
No? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And I've been a member of the Holocaust Education Foundation for almost 20 years, and I don't want to give too much history because Dr. Clifton Potter is here and he knows better than I do the origins, but correct me if I'm wrong, Clifton, but I think you started here about 22 years ago out of a need for 1993. And you and some students and Walter Skarosen got together and decided there was a need for this kind of education in Lynchburg, and we have just grown and grown since then. And education is the key word. We're really looking to share with young people ways to explore the nature of prejudice and hatred, and we do that through things like our evening tonight. We have a Holocaust awareness contest that we sponsored every year, so thousands of young people have explored the themes of the Holocaust in their artwork, in their writing, in their poetry. We bring poets, we bring speakers. Just this year we hosted Eva Kor, who is a survivor of Auschwitz and the subject of the film Forgiving Dr. Mengele. And we have a wonderful website. So if you want to visit us online, we now have a Facebook page. We're moving into the right century, I think. And we're very excited that this summer we are sponsoring a symposium for teachers. And it will be 2 days of workshop here at Lynchburg College, led by a nationally known Holocaust educator, Jennifer Goss. And then also the third day will be an optional trip to the Holocaust Museum in Richmond. So we're very excited about that. It will be free for teachers, and we'll also give you some of the great LC food and lots of free materials. So I have a few flyers for that. It's open mostly to teachers, secondary, in English and history, and librarians. But if you don't fill up, we'd like to open it up to other people. And I think first we're going to show a little trailer from John's book, and then we'll do a little more introduction.
We came with heavy suitcases.
Well, can you hear me? Is that working? Yeah. All the way back there? No? Oh. Closer? Can you hear me? Yeah, better? Best? How's that? Best?
Yes.
I'm here to talk about my parents. I like talking about my parents. They were slave laborers in concentration camps in Germany. My dad spent 5 years in Buchenwald concentration camp of about 40,000 people, 40,000 prisoners. My mother spent 2.5 years in various concentration camps and slave labor camps in Germany. One time, I told my mother I was going to be doing a presentation like this. And I said to her, "Mom, what do you want me to tell people?" And she said, "Tell them we weren't the only ones." She was afraid that people listening to me talk would get the impression that there were two people in these slave labor camps, my mother and my father. My mother wanted me to tell people that there were a lot of people in these camps. The low estimate is 12 million people in these concentration camps in Germany. What the Germans needed to do, what they felt they needed to do, was they needed to bring slave labor into the country because the German men were out busy trying to conquer the world. If you're trying to conquer the world, you can't have a day job in a factory or on a farm. You have to devote yourself entirely to trying to conquer the world. So they brought in slave labor from Poland and Czechoslovakia and France and Greece from every place. My father said that the first African-American person he ever saw in his life was in a concentration camp, Buchenwald concentration camp. He said there were people from all over the world in these camps. I'd like to talk about my parents' experiences in these camps, and I think I'll talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then I'll take questions. If you have questions, then just feel free to ask questions. I'd like to start with a poem that this little clip begins with. It's called a poem called Refugees. And the clip gives you a couple stanzas of the poem, and I want to give you the whole poem. And it's about when we finally came. The poem Refugees is about when we finally came to the United States and what it felt like when we came here after years, my parents spending years in slave labor camps, and after having spent 6 years in refugee camps in Germany. My father, it's hard for me to imagine. He was 19 years old when he was captured by the Germans. He spent the next 11 years living either in concentration camps or refugee camps. Hard for me to imagine. This is a poem about what it felt like when we came to the States. Refugees. We came with heavy suitcases made from wooden boards by brothers we left behind. Came from Buchenwald and Katowice, and before that, Lvov, our mother's true home. Came with our tongues in tatters, our teeth in our pockets, hugging only ourselves, our bodies stiff like frightened ostriches. We were the children in ragged wool who shuffled in line to eat or pray or beg anyone for charity. Remembering the air and the trees, the sky above the Polish fields, we dreamt only of the lives waiting for us in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Superior, Wisconsin, like pennies in our mouths. I want to read a poem about the day my mother was captured by the Germans. My mother was 19 years old, and the Germans came to her village, a small village west of Lvov. At that time it was in Poland. And these small villages were family villages, 200, 300 people, but everybody was related. They had been living there for hundreds of years, and everybody was family. And so when the Germans came into these villages, what they did was they took families, and they killed some of the family members, and other family members, the strong ones, the ones who looked like they could work, were taken to Germany as slave laborers. The poem is called My Mother Was 19. My mother was 19. Soldiers from nowhere came to my mother's farm, killed her sister's baby with their heels, shot my grandmother too. One time in the neck, then for kicks in the face lots of times. They saw my mother, they didn't care she was a virgin, dressed in a blue dress with tiny white flowers. They raped her so she couldn't stand up, couldn't lie down, couldn't talk. They broke her teeth when they shoved her dress into her mouth. If these guys had a camera, they would have taken her picture and sent it to her. That's the kind of men they were. Let me tell you, God doesn't give you any favors. He doesn't say, now you've seen this bad thing, and tomorrow you'll see some good thing. And when you see it, you'll be smiling. That's bullshit. I think the word bullshit was very important to my mother. It was one of the first American words that she learned. And for her, it summarized so much of what she felt about the world. I've got a poem called What the War Taught My Mother. And the poem begins, I think they did it in the video, the poem begins, she learned that sex is bad, men are worthless. And this is what my mother learned. Yeah. What the war taught her was that everything was worthless. Nothing could be depended on. She was able to escape from the Germans temporarily. She broke her way through this glass window and fled into these woods near her house. And what the German soldiers did is they went into those woods and they looked for the people who were trying to hide from them. And they gathered together these people, they gathered up these people, and they put them on a train and sent them to Magdeburg, Germany, a clearinghouse for the slave labor camps in Germany. I'd like to read a couple of poems about that train trip that she took in the boxcars to Germany. First one's called Cattle Train to Magdeburg. My mother still remembers the long train to Magdeburg. The boxcars bleached gray by Baltic winters. The rivers and the cities she had never seen before and would never see again. The sacred river Vistula, the smoke-haunted ruins of Warsaw, the river Warta, where horse flesh met steel and fell. The leather fists of pale German boys her own age, perhaps 17, perhaps 19, but different, convinced of their godhood by the cross they wore, different from the one she knew in Poland. The long twilight journey to Magdeburg, 4 days that became 6 years, 6 years that became 60, and always a train of boxcars bleached to Baltic gray. A lot of the stories that I got about my parents' experiences came from my dad. My mother found it pretty much impossible to talk about her experiences in these camps. I think she felt that she wanted to just not revisit those things because of how painful those memories were. And it surprised me when I would ask her to tell me stories about what happened, and she would just wave me away. She would say, I can't tell you these stories. I can't talk about these things. I would say, please tell me. And she would say, the only thing she would say was, if the Germans give you bread, you have to eat it. And if they beat you, you have to run away. And that's the only thing that she would say for a long, long time about her experiences. That's the only thing she would say. It wasn't until very late into her life, in her late 70s and her early 80s, that she started talking about her experiences. And I think in part that was because my father was the one who was responsible for telling these stories. He was like a designated storyteller in the family. He was the one who would tell stories about the war. But my mother couldn't tell stories about the war, not until he was gone. And then she started telling me stories. And I want to read a couple of poems that she told me after my father's death. The first one is called Cattle Train to Magdeburg. It's called My Mother Reads My Poem, Cattle Train to Magdeburg. I showed her this poem that I just read to you, the Cattle Train to Magdeburg poem. I showed her the poem, and she read it in Polish. I showed her a Polish copy of it, and she read it in Polish, and she said, that's not the way it was. The story had come to me largely from my father, and she read the thing. She says, oh no, that's not the way it was. Let me tell you how it was. And as a good writer, what I did, of course, if somebody starts telling you that you're wrong in a story, or you've got a story wrong, the first thing you need to do is grab a legal pad and start writing down what the real version of it is, or what the different version of it is. So I wrote down what she said, and it became this poem. My mother reads my poem, Cattle Train to Magdeburg. My mother looks at me and says, that's not how it was. I couldn't see anything except when they stopped the boxcars and opened the doors. And I didn't see any of those rivers. And if I did, I didn't know their names. No one said, look, this river is the Vata, and that's the sacred Vistula. What I remember is the bodies being pushed out. Sometimes women would kick them out with their feet. Now it sounds terrible. You think we were bad women, but we weren't. We were girls taken from homes alone. Some had seen terrible things done to their families. Even though you're a grown man and a teacher, we saw things I don't want to tell you. When she told me this story, I asked her, I said, what is it that you don't want to tell me? And she said, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. And she repeated it. She says, you'll think we were terrible. And I pressed her, and I pressed her. And what she finally told me was that the bodies that were being kicked out of the boxcar by these girls were the bodies of babies, stillborn babies. These girls that were captured by the Germans, it was a boxcar, 150, 200 girls from all over. And these girls were young, they were 16, 17, 18, and a lot of them were carrying babies. They were young mothers. And the conditions in these boxcars, I mean, these boxcars were tiny. You see these trains going along the James River, and these boxcars are enormous, right? They're like from over there to over there. And you could say, well, yeah, 150 people, you'd have some room to move around with. But these boxcars, they were from about over here to about over here, and they were about this wide. And there were 200 people in this boxcar. I think we've got about maybe 200 people here today. Imagine all of us, I should ask everybody to come down. Imagine coming down here and trying to fit into this space. And these girls were in those boxcars for a week or more, and they lost these babies. And what these girls had to do, the only thing they could do was to kick the babies out with their feet, to get them out of the boxcar, these dead babies. I want to read some poems about my dad. My father, when he was finally liberated by the American soldiers in 1945, he weighed 75 pounds. Anybody weigh 75 pounds? I think one time I did a presentation like this, and there was somebody who was a sixth grader, and she weighed 75 pounds. My dad weighed 75 pounds when he was liberated. He lived for 5 years on 600 calories a day. When the war ended, it was like he never stopped eating after the war ended. We would sit down to breakfast, and my father would have a half dozen eggs and a circle of Polish sausage. He would eat 4 or 5 bowls of soup. I mean, he was always eating food. When he died, he weighed 260 pounds. And it was like he never stopped eating. saw friends die of starvation. He himself, for 5 years, was living on 600 calories a day. And one of the things he always talked about was the food in Buchenwald and how little of the food there was. I wrote a series of poems called Hunger in the Labor Camps. I'm going to read you a couple of these. This one's called What My Father Ate. My father ate what he couldn't eat, what his mother taught him not to. Brown grass, small chips of wood, the dirt beneath his gray, dark fingernails. He ate the leaves off trees. He ate bark. He ate the flies that tormented the mules working in the fields. He ate what would kill a man in the normal course of his life. Leather buttons, cloth caps, anything small enough to get into his mouth. He ate roots, he ate newspaper. In his slow, clumsy hunger, my father did what the birds did. Picked for oats or corn or any kind of seed left in the dry dung by the cows. And when there was nothing to eat, he'd search the ground for pebbles, and they would loosen his saliva, and he would swallow that. And the other men did the same. This is the second poem in the sequence. It's called What a Starving Man Has. He has his skin. He has a thinness to his eyes no bread will ever redeem. He has no belly, and his long muscles stand out in relief as if they had been flayed. He is a bony mule with the hard eyes one sees in nightmares or in hell. And he dreams of cabbages and potatoes the way a young boy dreams of woman's breasts. They come uncalled for, round and fevered like rain that will never stop. There is always the empty sea in his belly, rising, falling, and seeking land. And next to him, there's always another starving man who says, "Help me, brother, I am dying here." In Buchenwald, as I mentioned, there's a camp of about 40,000 prisoners. And every year, about 25% of the prisoners would die from cruelty, brutality, starvation. My father told a story about one January night, late in the war, when it was very cold, around zero, and the snow was falling. And the German guards called all of the soldiers from my father's barracks, about 400 soldiers, 400 prisoners, called 400 prisoners out of their barracks and had them line up in the quad in front of the barracks. And the German soldiers started reading the roll call. And they went down the list of names, and he would read out each name. And while this was happening, it was cold, and the snow was falling, and prisoners started falling down, falling to their knees, and then collapsing, falling over completely. And the German guards got to the end of their list, of the roll call, and he said, "I think we forgot somebody." And he started the roll call again. And he read through all of the names again. And more men fell down and fell into the snow and collapsed. And then the Germans read through the roll again. They did this for 6 hours, from midnight until 6 in the morning. And at 6 in the morning, the German guards finally said, "I think we've got everybody down." And they marched the remaining prisoners into their barracks. And the fellows who were left, prisoners who were left, they were all dead or dying. And the Germans sent garbage trucks to pick up these prisoners. And they put the prisoners in the garbage trucks. And then they sent the garbage trucks to the ovens to burn the prisoners. My father said, I asked my father once if it was a death camp he was in, and he said it wasn't a death camp, it was a slow death camp. Gradually, people wasted away or killed by this sort of brutality. I've got a poem in this book called Killing, and it's based on a conversation I had with my father about killing. It's called What My Father Knows About Killing. My father knows men and animals do not die the same way. A man will kill a horse or a cow or a pig with respect he would never show to another man. Killing a pig, a man will steady it, prepare it for a single killing blow, work to make its suffering quick, if not instant. A poised hammer ready to strike down in such a way the pig won't see it or hear it, will hardly feel it on the back of its head in that one sure spot that will end it before it knows it. My father knows that this isn't the way men kill each other. He has seen men crucified and hung, castrated and frozen to death, women raped and beaten and shot, their breasts torn apart by bayonets, their babies thrown and scattered in the air like sand. He says that suffering is the sauce we reserve for men and women. Suffering is the sauce we reserve for men and women. I want to read a poem about my mother called Beats. Take a drink of water. My mother arrived in Germany in November. That train that took her to Magdeburg then took her to this camp. And she and a bunch of the girls from her village were loaded onto trucks and taken to a farm. And it was snowing, it was cold, it was November. The girls were dressed in what they had been dressed in when they had been captured by the Germans. They had dresses on, they had no gloves, they had no hats, no coats. They were just dressed the way they had been dressed. And the Germans sent them out into this field and told them to start digging the beets. And the ground was frozen, and they weren't given shovels, they weren't given axes, they weren't given picks, they weren't given sticks to dig in the soil for these beets. They were just told to dig for the beets. My mother, if I said to her, Mom, tell me about what it was like working in the camps, my mother would always talk about the beets. And I've got a poem I call The Beets. Here it is. The beets. My mother tells me of the beets she dug up in Germany. They were endless, redder than roses gone bad in an early frost, redder than a grown man's kidney or heart. The first beet she remembers, she was alone in a field, alone without her mother or father near, no sister even. They were all dead, left behind in Poland. The ground was wet and cold, but not soft, never soft. She ate the raw beet, even though she knew they would beat her. She says sometimes she pretended she was deaf, stupid, crippled, or diseased with typhus or cholera, even with what the children called the French disease. Anything to avoid the slap, the whip across her back, the leather fist in her face above her eye. If she could have given them her breasts to suck, her womb to penetrate, she would have, just so they would not hurt her the way they hurt her sister and her mother and the baby. She wonders, what was her reward for living in such a world? It was not love or money. She wonders if God will remember her labors. She wonders if there is a God. The war ended in May 1945, and my parents were liberated by the American soldiers. I want to read a prose poem about the day they met. My father, in 1945, would have been 25 years old. He would have spent 5 years in these camps. My mother was, I'm trying to do the math, 23 years old. She had been captured a couple of years earlier. When my father tells the story about how they met at the time of liberation, he always made the story really short, which wasn't his way at all. My father was always telling these stories and elaborating on these stories. My father said when he met my mother, first they had something to eat, and then they got married. That's all my father had said. And years later, I asked my mother about this. And she said, "You want to know what it was like when I met your father?" This is the poem. Again, it's a poem. You know, sometimes when you're a writer, you're lucky, and somebody tells you something, and you just write it down, and you write really quickly, because you know you can never get it better than the way you're hearing it right now. And that's the way it was when my mother told me this. I wrote it fast as I could. Let's see if I can find it. Here it is. My mother tells me how she met my father. This is her words, her language. "I first saw him in front of the barracks. He was walking with 6 other prisoners, a German soldier behind them, pushing at them with some kind of rifle. Your father wasn't how he is now. He was skinny then, like 2 shoelaces tied together. I was not such a prize after 3 years in the camps either. When the Americans came, they weighed me and found I was less than 100 pounds. And what was I wearing? You want to know? Woolens on my legs, a gray rag to hide my hair, a striped dress. And him, your father, like I said, skinny with a bleeding towel across his face from where he lost his eye. Still, he walked up to me, took my hand and said in Polish, 'Proszę pani.' Yes. He said, 'Please, miss.' And like a proper gentleman, he clicked his heels. I thought he was at least a count, maybe a prince. Then, just before your father had a chance to kiss my hand, the German behind him kicked him in the pants and said, 'Don't go raus! Get moving, dummy.' Your father was like that, always putting on airs. Even then, in the camps, talking about Polish honor as if Polish honor and he shared a soul. Really, he was worthless. I wish he had left me there in the camps. He couldn't drive a car. He couldn't fix a leaky roof. When I asked him in the refugee camp to help me pack to come to America, he took a little drink of vodka and bundled all the clothes together in a bedspread, like America was across the street. The fool. I should have kicked him like the German soldier did when I met him. Instead, I kissed him and wept. When she told me that story, and when she said, I kissed him and wept, it surprised me. It was a conversation I was having with my mother. My mother must have been 78, 79 years old. I was about 60 years old. And here she is, she's telling me that she wept. And I never experienced her weeping. I had never seen her weeping. I had never seen her show much of any kind of emotion. Joy, love, nothing. I remember as a kid, I would try to hug her. I would see other kids hugging their mothers, and I tried to hug her. My mother would always push me away. There was something about her experience made it so that the things that she saw happen to her mother and her sister and the sister's baby, the things she saw happen in the camps, made it so she couldn't express emotions the way you and I express emotions. She couldn't. I remember when I was a kid, we would get letters from Poland, and these letters were from her sister who was left behind in Poland and who stayed in Poland after the war. And my mother, she couldn't read these letters in front of us. She had to go into her bedroom to read these letters. And sometimes my sister and I, we would go to the bedroom door. She would close the bedroom door, and we'd go to the bedroom door, and we would listen to our mother. And we knew she was reading the letters because she would be weeping reading these letters. But the weeping was something she couldn't show us. I'm going to read one more poem, and then we'll talk. We're running out of time. It's a new poem that I wrote, and it's about the day I was born in a refugee camp. I was born in 1948, and somebody once said to me, "You never write about yourself." And I said, "Well, I write about my parents." He said, "You never write about yourself." So I gave myself the task of writing about myself. I think I failed. It's a poem called "The Day I Was Born in a Refugee Camp." The day I was born in the refugee camp. My mother washed her face in cold water, tied her hair back, and put on an old dress. She said she knew my birth would be hard, that she had given birth before to my sister, and that then the dirt had flushed out of her body like a rabid dog that had finally snapped its leash. She said she was alone that day I was born. My father had seen my sister Danusha being born 2 years earlier, and he wept and said to my mother that he couldn't go through that again. So she told him he should just leave, take the money they had and go buy himself some vodka or whiskey, find a barn he could crawl into and drown himself in the drink, drown himself until he couldn't hear her screams or see the mess that was coming. There was no one with her to help her with the darkness and the screaming when I started to come. There was just me and the tearing in her stomach and her bones breaking apart like God had decided to squeeze her until she was nothing but blood exploding through her useless skin in his dirty hands. And feeling the river of shit and squeezing and bones breaking, she remembered the road that brought her there to that refugee camp in Germany and that darkness. She remembered the Germans who killed her mother and raped her sister and kicked her sister's baby to death, and the years in the slave labor camp when the guards would promise her a potato if she would suck them, a piece of meat if she would fuck them, and she remembered being thankful for the food. She remembered, too, the time after the war when the other women in the refugee camp struggled to hold on to their babies because they knew that giving birth to them would kill them because their wombs were still in the war, still weak and tortured and beaten, still kicked and stabbed and wounded, still bleeding and crying and hoping, still falling and slipping and starving, still kneeling and begging and weeping, still everything that had happened since the day the Germans put her and the girls from her village on the train to bring them to this Germany where every birth was a struggle in the mud for a breath. And she screamed then, and knew that screaming was useless. And so she screamed again and kept screaming until a flood came, and my bones poured from her flesh like tomatoes exploding in the hands of a dirty God who didn't care about what she remembered or feared or wept over. She knew that all God wanted was to hold another life in his hand, and that nothing she could beg for would change the way he turned the baby, regarded it, and let it live or die. That's it. I got nothing else to say. I'm happy to take questions from anyone about anything. Yeah, yes.
How old were you when you realized what had happened to your parents?
You know, the question was, how old was I when I realized what happened to my family? Yeah, I was hearing these stories from my father. My father was just a compulsive talker. And I was hearing these stories 5, 6, 7 years old. I was hearing these stories. And the story, the image in his head, there were 2 images in his head that he couldn't get out. And one was an image of a German soldier cutting off the breasts of a woman. He couldn't get this image out of his head, and he would just sit there and he would talk. And the other image was he saw a Polish soldier who died, and he had been in some kind of fire, and his body was draped over some barbed wire. And these are the 2 images. And so my father would sit down and he'd have a drink, and he would start talking about this. And my mother would say, "Please, stop telling these stories." And he couldn't stop telling stories. He was a compulsive talker. So like me, he's a compulsive talker. And he had a photograph of 4 of his friends who were lynched, who were hanged by the Germans. And he would take this photograph, he had it in his wallet, he would take this photograph out of his wallet, and any opportunity he could, he would show this photograph, and he would say, "I was there, I saw this, these were friends of mine, the Germans did this to them." He wanted people to know about what happened. He was always talking. And my mother would she'd put her hands over her ears and just walk out of the room. Sometimes she would knock him down. She would be in a chair and she would just push the chair over. She would get so angry that he was telling these stories. She would just push him down and walk out of the room. Yeah, Barry. Hi, Barry.
Hey.
Friend of mine.
I just wonder, I've heard you read these before, of course, it just always was new, but I just wonder, did your dad, because he was so talkative, did you ever get a chance to share the stories of other Holocaust survivors?
Oh, yeah.
Were you there when he did that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, the question was, did he share these stories with other guys? Yeah, men and women. We lived in Chicago in an area, on my block, 2700 block of Evergreen, still there. Every house had survivors in it. We lived in an apartment building. There was a Jewish family in the back, who lived in the back on the first floor, and they were survivors. There was a Russian family. This guy had been in a concentration camp. He was on the 3rd floor, in the back on the 3rd floor. Richard Menedicki's father, and there was my family, and there were other. There was another Polish family that had been in the camps, in the slave labor camps with my parents. And this was our building. 4 families that had been in the war had seen these terrible things, and then the house next door was another family like that, and the house next door was another family like that. Then there was another apartment building with 2 or 3 families. I mean, there were so many people in my neighborhood who had been in the war. And that's just on my side of the block. On Facebook, Facebook is it's a miracle machine. I met a guy who lived across the street, a kid who grew up at the same time I was growing up. And everybody that he knew on the other side of the street, all of the parents, had been in the camps. So I knew the people from the camps on my side of the street. I didn't know the people from the camps on the other side of the street. And my father would get together. These people would get together. And they would talk into the night. They would drink and talk. I remember this one guy, Bruno, I can't remember his last name, had been in the camps. He was a mandolin player, and he would play these, people would talk, and then he would play the mandolin, and he loved playing Red River Valley. And so these Polish guys, who had been in these concentration camps, were sitting there telling stories, and then he would break out his mandolin and play Red River Valley. And we were sleeping, thinking, why don't you go to sleep? Stop telling those stories. Like Patty said, there was the guy in the hardware store in the corner of Washington on Division. Guy my dad liked a lot. They would talk all the time. And he had been in Auschwitz. He was the fellow with the Auschwitz tattoo. Yes, miss.
I know that you said that obviously your parents came to America after they were liberated, but did they ever talk about like plans to try to go back to like Poland at all? Like did they ever?
Yeah. The question was, did they ever talk about going back to Poland? Not for a long time. They were afraid of the communists. Yeah. My uncle, my mom's brother, one of my mom's brothers, he had spent 4 years in a concentration camp in Germany, and then at the end of the war, he was living in one of these refugee camps that were UN sponsored. And the UN was trying to get people to go back home to where the countries they came from. And so they gave him a ticket and put my uncle on a UN train, yeah, with UN guards on it. The train full of these people who had been in these concentration camps in Germany. The train went back to his hometown. He got off the train. The Russians grabbed him, put him on another train, sent him to Siberia, to a concentration camp in Siberia. My uncle never came back. And so, people were afraid to go back because of this kind of stuff. My parents finally went back after the communists left, like 1990. And my mother lost her mother, her sister's baby. She wanted to go back, and she wanted to see where these things had happened, and she wanted to visit the grave. And so she went back to this village. And like I said, it was a small village, mostly family living in it. There was nobody in the village who remembered her family. I mean, all of these people who just, after that village had been wiped out, they brought in new people came in. And my mother went to the cemetery, and she looked through the cemetery, and she talked to the priest in town, asking, are there any records? She never found the grave. Doesn't know what happened to her mother or her sister's baby. That was the one time they went back to Poland. And they said they left it when they were kids. It was like 1940. They came back in 1990. It had changed so much that they felt completely foreign. They felt alien in the country that they thought that should feel like home. Yes.
Often we hear so many stories about survivors' children who talk about how they grew up in a house of silence. And obviously your experience was quite different, at least with your father. I'm just wondering how, even as a 5 or 6 year old, you processed.
how did I, as a 5 or 6-year-old, how did I process these stories? That my father was telling me about the terrible things he saw. My response, I know what my response was. My response was to get as far away from my father as possible. And to get as far away from all of this stuff as possible. I had friends, it was like, I had friends in my neighborhood who embraced where they came from. And then there were people in my neighborhood, other friends I had, who disavowed, just rejected completely everything they came from. And I was one of the people who rejected this stuff. I had friends who would study Polish on Saturdays, who would go to these, Polish events, do all of this stuff. I could never do that. One of my best friends from the time I grew up, from the time I was growing up, ended up being the director of the Polish Museum of America in Chicago. And he hears me tell these stories, and he says, "Oh, no, it wasn't like that at all." And and I talk about running away from all my Polish stuff. He said, "Oh, no. His experience, my experience, different experiences. It wasn't until I did start thinking about my parents until I was 31 years old. And I didn't start thinking about their experiences as something that I wanted to understand until I was 31 years old. I was in graduate school and I wrote one poem about my parents. And it got me thinking about them. And then I wrote another poem, and I wrote some more. But it was, I was 31 years old. And I think I had been away from it so long that I guess it wasn't disturbing me as much as it had been disturbing me as a kid growing up.
In one of your poems, you talk about, I think it was your mother not sure if there was a God.
Oh, yeah.
With such horrific memories and
Yeah.
experiences, what kind of faith was there in your household?
My father had no education. He literally had no education. He could sign his name almost. I see his name signed, and he misspells it every time. He had just no education. My mother had some education. My mother didn't believe in anything. My father had a 5-year-old's belief in Jesus and religion and in human goodness. And this stuff, my mother would listen to this stuff, and she just couldn't believe it. I'm going to read you. Can I read another poem? I got time. I'll read you 2 poems. Okay. This is one of them is about what my mother believed, and the other one is what my father believed. So I can find it. Yeah, page 19. What the war taught me. I think we had a part of this in this thing. My mother learned that sex is bad. Men are worthless. It is always cold, and there is never enough to eat. She learned that if you are stupid with your hands, you will not survive the winter, even if you survive the fall. She learned that only the young people survive the camps. The old ones are left in piles like worthless paper, and babies are scarce like chickens and bread. She learned that the world is a broken place where no birds sing, and even angels cannot bear the sorrows God gives them. She learned that you don't pray your enemies will not torment you. You only pray they won't kill you. Let me find the poem. What my father believed. How these people say that? What my father believed. He didn't know about the Rock of Ages, or bringing in the sheaves, or Jacob's ladder, or gathering at the beautiful river that flows beneath the throne of God. He'd never heard of the Baltimore Catechism either. And he didn't know that the purpose of life was to love and honor and serve God. He'd been to the village church as a boy in Poland, and he knew he was Catholic because his mother and father were buried in a cemetery under wooden crosses. His sister Catherine was buried there too. The day their mother died, Catherine took to the kitchen corner where the stove sat and cried. She wouldn't eat or drink, just cried until she died there, died of a broken heart. She was 3 or 4 years old, he was 5. What my dad knew about the nature of God and religion came from the sermons the priest told at Mass, and this got mixed up with his own life. He knew living was hard and that even children are meant to suffer. Sometimes when he was drinking, he'd ask, did God send his own son here to suffer? My father believed we are here to lift logs that cannot be lifted, to hammer steel nails so bent they crack when we hit them. In the slave labor camps in Germany, he had seen men try to do the impossible and fail. He believed life is hard and we should help each other. If you see someone on a cross, his weight pulling him down and breaking his muscles, you should try to lift him, even if only for a second, even though you know lifting won't save him. When my mom was dying, when my father was dying, in the hospice, one of the first things he said, he wanted to make sure that there would be a priest there to give him the last rites. When my mom was dying, 8 years later, I said to her, Mom, do you want me to have a priest here? And she said, no. No priest has ever come back from heaven to tell us what's there. And she refused to have a priest. There was a guy walking around. she just wouldn't do it. Yeah.
Your parents survived, sort of.
Yeah.
You survived their survival.
Yeah.
And as you look at it with distance and perspective, what kind of meaning do you eke out of this?
Boy, what kind of, I think I take something from my mother and something from my father. My mother, I think the only thing my mother believed in was just going on. Just trying to get from this day into the next day, into the next day. She had 2 cancers late in her life. She had a breast removed. She also had ovarian cancer, had to have a hysterectomy. She was crippled at the very end. She had terrible arthritis, couldn't stand up. And she told, I would say to her, I remember one time I went to see her in the hospital after she had her hysterectomy. And I said, Mom, let me read you the book. Any opportunity I can read. Maybe. My mother's optimism. Yeah, it was an optimism. What was this optimism based on? I guess that's your question. That's the question you're asking me. I have no idea. So, excuse me. My mother's optimism. When she was 78 years old and the angel of death called to her and told her the vaginal bleeding that had been starting and stopping like a crazy menopausal period was ovarian cancer, she said to him, listen, doctor, I don't have to tell you your job. Listen, doctor, I don't have to tell you your job. If it's cancer, it's cancer. If you got to cut it out, you got to cut it out. After surgery, in the convalescent home, among the old men crying for their mothers, and the silent roommates waiting for death, my mother called me over to see her wound. Stapled and stitched 14 raw inches from below her breasts to below her navel. And when I said, "Mom, I don't want to see it," she said, "Johnny, don't be such a baby." 6 months later, at the end of her chemo, my mother knows why the old men cry. A few wiry strands of hair on her head, her hands so weak she couldn't hold a cup, her legs swollen and blotched with blue lesions. She says, "I'll get better." After his chemo, Pauline's second husband had 10 more years. He was playing golf and breaking down doors when he died of a heart attack at 90. Then my mom's eyes lock on mine and she says, "You know, optimism is a crazy man's mother." And she laughs. Optimism is a crazy man's mother. How can you, how can you explain this stuff?
Do you think it's because she survived?
I think there had to be some part of it. I mean, she did survive all of these terrible things, all of the stuff that happened to her. My father would tell me these stories. Oh yeah, he's telling the story about the woman getting her breast cut off. And these terrible things that he saw. His friend, he had a friend who was castrated in front of him and then crucified. Just terrible stuff. And my father would say to me, "No matter how bad my stories are, what happened to your mother was worse." And she survived these crazy, terrible, terrible things. And I think she believed in her own ability to survive. When she was dying, she was doing fine, and then she had a massive stroke. And she had always said, "Oh yeah, when I get really bad, when it gets to the final time for me, when it gets to that point where I can't do anything for myself anymore, and the doctor comes to you and says, 'Do you want us to put her to sleep?' She said, tell them you want me to tell them that I want to be put to sleep." So there I am. I'm in that situation. And my sister, who won't have anything to do with my mother, she's not at the hospital. Hasn't seen my mother for 7 years. I'm the only one there. The doctor comes up to me and she says, "You want to put your mother to sleep?" She had this terrible. She couldn't talk, couldn't move. Her hands could barely make some kind of facial gesture. And I said to her, "Mom, do you want me to have the doctor put you to sleep?" And she said, she struggled to say no. And she said, she struggled to say no. She said, "No, that's my mom." Optimism is a crazy man's mother.
But don't you think maybe it's because for all those years that she was a prisoner, the Germans were attempting to kill her
Yeah.
by starvation, by work,
Oh,
by
yeah.
whatever, and she survived, and now she was going to die on her own terms.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yes. My mother had her own terms, yes. There was no one. What she had was tremendous willpower. I mean, she comes to America as a refugee after 6 years in a refugee camp. They came with a wooden suitcase. In that poem, the refugees poem, we came with a wooden suitcase. It was a wooden suitcase, and we had a hot water bottle in there, and we had a frying pan in there, and we had a pillow in that suitcase. That's what we had when we came. 3 years later, they own an apartment house in Chicago, and they just never looked back at that stuff. They had a belief that they would be able to do stuff and survive and just move forward.
How many years did you live in the camps?
I was there. I was born in 1948. I had 3 years. It was just we left the camps in 1951. So I was just 3 years old. I've got really sketchy memories, really minuscule memories of the camps. Yeah, and for me, the camps were fine. When I was a kid growing up, I didn't feel the deprivation. In fact, when we came to America, we had to spend a year as sort of indentured farm workers to a farmer in upstate New York. And the whole family, I'm a 3-year-old, I'm picking strawberries, I'm picking apples off of trees. My sister's 5 years old, she's working on this farm. My parents, we're all working on this farm. And I begged my mother to let us go back to Germany. I said, Mom, it wasn't this hard in Germany, because I didn't have to work in Germany. Nobody in the camps, in the refugee camps, worked. And so this work I was doing in America, I thought, America, heck with America. I want to go back to the camps. Yeah, yes.
You try to stay away from your parents' story and then you turn around and it looks like it's a mission of sorts now for you.
Yeah,
what is your mission? What is your message?
I think my mission is my father's mission. That poem, what my father believed in, help people when you can. Don't be a bad guy. I think, be kind, be hopeful. Just very simple sort of things that I believe in. I would like to see people be hopeful and be kind to each other. I think it's probably a universal sort of desire. Anybody else?
Where was the farm in upstate New York?
Oh, I've got the guy's address. When my mother didn't want to talk about anything for years, and then after my dad died, she was just always talking, and I would go to her house, and she would say, pull out your legal pad, and she would say, I got to tell you about this, and she would start talking, and I'm writing this stuff down, and one night we had a conversation about the farm outside of Buffalo, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in the book about the farm outside of Buffalo, what it was like.
And then you went to your father from there?
My father.
What kind of work then did your father find?
Well, what was interesting was I said to my dad, I said, why didn't you, my father was a farm boy growing up. I mean, he knew farms. Same thing with my mother. My mother survived because she was a farmer. She knew how to milk a cow. And the Germans, one day they came through and said, does anybody know how to milk a cow? It's December, it's November, the snow is falling, it's 0 degrees. The Germans said, does anybody here know how to milk a cow? My mother raises her hand, and they go and they put her next to these cows, and you say, milk these cows. If you've ever worked with cows are really hot. They generate a lot of heat, generate a lot of steam in the winter. You see the steam rising off of these cows. And the heat and the milk that she got from this cow. She used to say that even though she knew the Germans would beat her for drinking the milk from this cow, she would still drink the milk from this cow. She would sneak the milk. I'm sorry, I lost your question. What did you ask?
What kind of work then did your father do?
Oh, yeah. When I said to my dad, why don't you stay on the farm? Because the farmer in Buffalo wanted them to stay on the farm. He liked the work they did. He got along with my parents. And my father said, both my parents said they didn't want to have anything to do with farms. That farm work was so difficult, they didn't want to do farm work anymore. And so they had a friend, this guy, Bangladesh, who had been in Buchenwald with my dad. And he had gone, his sponsor had moved to Chicago. And so he told my parents, come to Chicago. There's a lot of factory work here. You can do as much work as you want. My father, for years, for the first 3 or 4 years that we were in America, he worked 2 shifts a day. And now people say, well, everybody works 2 shifts, and everybody doesn't work 2 shifts. But he worked 2 shifts a day, and there was sometimes he wouldn't even come home on weekends. He had a cot in the factory, and he slept on that cot in the factory. The factory was not that far from our house, and we would carry food to him, and give him the food, and he would have his week's food from us. And then we'd go home, and he'd just stay in the factory all the time. And in 3 years, he made enough money to buy this apartment house that he ended up living in.
Do you have children?
Got a daughter, and got a granddaughter. My daughter is Lillian Guzlowski. She's an assistant principal at EC Glass. It's why I'm here. I retired to be close to her. She's got a wonderful granddaughter, Luciana.
How old is your granddaughter?
She's going to be 7.
So, have you told your daughter all these stories?
Yeah, one of the questions was, what can you tell? What should you tell your kids? I heard all of these terrible stories when I was a kid, and then my question was, when I was a kid, when I was an adult, should I tell my daughter about this stuff? And I asked my wife, I asked my parents, both my parents were still alive at that time, and they said, my parents said, look, you know what, don't tell her. And but then when we would go visit my parents, my daughter was 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. She would pick it up from them. My father wasn't telling these terrible stories that he had been telling years ago when I was a kid. I guess he learned a little self-control. But she learned very quickly. I asked her about, when she was in college, I said to her, I asked her if she felt that I had told her too much, if she had learned too much about my parents growing up. And she said no. That she felt that it was really important to know about what had happened to my parents. And she, in fact, she felt very close to my parents. She was always coming with me she was always going with me over to my parents' house and visiting my parents, and sometimes she would stay there for a week or two. She was very, very close to my parents, and my parents loved her.
Shall we take one more question?
Okay. Yeah, one more question.
Last one? Anybody?
You've heard all my secrets, I don't know.
Well, can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Looking at the refugee crisis today,
Yeah.
how do you think your parents would respond to what's happening?
How would my parents respond to the refugee crisis? My parents were very conservative. And I think that even though they went through these terrible experiences as refugees themselves, I think that they would have a very negative view of the refugee situation, and would probably support a presidential candidate who would severely limit the number of refugees coming into the country. One of the things, the only thing my father and I ever argued about, we were always on the same line. The only time we would argue was about politics and that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you, everybody. So